イケル・スペンサーさんです。よろしくお願いいたします。
すみません、英語で。ごめんなさい。So, oh, I was expecting this photograph. If you'd spoken to me 20 years ago, you would have found me in this situation. In fact, there I was, right in the middle of the LSO. My first visit to Japan was with the LSO, and I came with Leonard Bernstein. But I worked with Paul McCartney, I worked on Star Wars. I've had many interesting experiences with London Symphony Orchestra. But now, you will probably find me in these sorts of situations. I run a lot of training workshops, I do a lot of public speaking, I work with children, I even worked with Ronald McDonald at one point in Florida, but in all sorts of different situations and all sorts of different places around the world. These are some of the people I work with now, which seems a long way from playing the violin. There are banks, there are pharmaceutical companies, I've worked on branding programs, I've worked on product development programs, I've even worked with accountants on leadership programs. So quite a long way, you would think, from playing the violin and being involved with music. My reason for being here at the moment is actually a training program we're running at Ueno Gakuen for facilitators, people who are going to go and work with the arts in communities in an educational way. And there is a new movement in Japan looking very much at this way of working. But how was it that I moved from being a musician into this whole world? It's about 20 years ago when I came involved with arts education, and I suddenly realized what a powerful educational tool it could be. But in order to do that, you needed to change the way you thought about the arts, and it wasn't just a matter of them being a decoration. They have a valuable role to play in society, but you have to turn them upside down, and you've got to look at them in a different way and how process works. This is a picture from a movement called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, another way at looking at visual art as a training program. And it seems to me, particularly in the case of music, the problem is that we look at music as being either a skill or as a service. We like to hear people play violins, we admire them for their skill, or we play music at parties, or we go to concerts. What we very rarely do is to look at music and the arts as a sort of a process. And when you look at music as a process, it certainly takes on a whole different form. How does music work? How do musicians work together? How do we create music? How do we communicate with people? So that the action of making music together has a history really going back 2 million years. We have a musical connection which is deep within us as human beings. But it involves people doing it and learning by doing and experimenting. And it's good to do this way with both children and also with adults. And I'm going to show you a little example of this. You all know Vivaldi's Four Seasons. It's that sort of piece that people like to hear in elevators. It's that. Well, you might not know it, but actually, Vivaldi wrote that piece about the Italian countryside, not the Japanese countryside. It's actually 18th century Italy, and it's the sounds that you might hear. Here are some of the birds. Here's another. So this is a dawn chorus, the sort you'd hear in Europe, not in Japan. And we know this because Vivaldi wrote a set of poems before he wrote the music. And he's very clear which parts of the music relate to the weather or the birds. So by getting children to write creative poems and take part in creative action and then make their own music in the way that they see it work, they can actually cover matters of environment, geography, weather, nature, getting to know the music itself. But there's a much deeper learning process that takes place. And it's the softer skills that we like to think we need these days, particularly in the current global environment of learning. And it's to do with the social skills of communication, perception, analytical skills, intellectual development, and particularly creativity. We all talk about creativity these days. Sometimes I wonder if we know what it really means. So these projects help us to cover all these different areas of learning for adults as well as children. And in October this year, we ran a small version of this project at the Karean Hiroba, which we filled with birdsong and the sounds of weather. And we talked about why do birds make their songs? What is different about them? What is the purpose of them? And it's interesting to think that these children who attended actually may never really hear authentic birdsong. They're basically city dwellers. They've never been into the countryside. And as the migration is moving people from the countryside into the cities, it may well be that some of these young children will never actually come into contact with nature in its essence. And this is all part of a community and education movement which is taking root in Japan very strongly at the moment. It's been happening over the past 2 years, I would say, really taking root. And it comes from a movement which started largely in the UK some time ago, but it's spreading in many, many different areas. But I'd like to propose a different way of looking at education. Rather than focusing on subject matters and curriculum matters, we really need to be looking at these three issues here, about choices, how we're curious about things, and how we build relationships. These are all the skills you get from being a musician. And there's a global context to it, because global development now means that technology is driving things forwards, there's economic instability and volatility, and the demographic of nations is changing, particularly in Japan. You have a problem facing you with the ratio between the old and the young. So our last question I want to leave you with is, are we really preparing our young people for the future that faces them? The things we teach them today may actually be out of date in 5 years' time. Thank you very much. Awari desu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spencer. It was very, very interesting. I'd like to ask you one question. It was really sort of combining music and education together was an interesting idea. And I'd like to ask you, how did you come up with the idea, or were there any significant tipping point for you?
There was an interesting movement about 20 years ago in the UK which I got involved in, and it just seemed to me that I was able to use the arts in a much more effective way than just being a player. It's important to be a player, it's important to be a high-level artist, but actually we have these other skills which we can acquire and which in a social context are far more useful.
All right, thank you very much, Mr.